Welcome to Practicing Social Advocacy, the mini-series. I'm Noam Soker, the UW Combined Fund Drive student intern, bringing you a collection of short interviews with experts who deliver straightforward strategies for becoming more engaged global citizens. As part of the Whole U's first 90-day wellness challenge, the UW CFD staff are facilitating a 90-day habit formation program focused on helping participants to identify, connect with, and engage on behalf of causes of which they are passionate. We are guided by our theme, Identify, Assess, Act, Social Advocacy for Everyone. I'm very excited to welcome Courtney Acitelli, Director of UW Impact. Thank you so much for coming to talk today. You ready to start?
I'm ready. Thanks for having me.
Great. So my first question for you is, how would you define social advocacy or social justice?
So I think of social advocacy and social justice as being two different things, but of course they are related. So when I think about social justice, we're talking about seeking equity, maybe equity of opportunity or equity of economic opportunity, equity in various, realms. When we're talking about social advocacy, we're talking about an organized effort to affect that equity. So maybe you're organizing with other like-minded folks and you're trying to change laws or policies or even public opinion, I would argue, is social advocacy too.
Great. And I appreciate that you're bringing up the idea of organizing, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. So where did you start your journey with social advocacy, with potentially organizing or being involved in an organization?
Sure. Well, I can tell you that I started my journey with thinking about social justice when I was 15. I decided that I didn't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance any longer and really made a ruckus in my homeroom when I decided that I would sit during the pledge because I did not believe that our country offered liberty and justice for all, right? This was extremely controversial in my Southern not university, high school. It did create something of a movement. I think a couple other folks wanted to do it. A lot of people were absolutely appalled. But it was the first time that I realized that my own voice had some power. The principal told me that I was allowed to not say the pledge. However, he wanted me to stand. So there was some compromise in there. And of course, when you're negotiating with power like that, you start to understand how the system works. So then I took that into probably my first opportunities to be part of organizations where I cared very deeply about the mission. I started in AIDS organizations. So I both volunteered for and worked in AIDS service or AIDS organizations that were aimed at the crisis that was just absolutely huge in the late 80s and early 90s when I was just becoming an adult. So that was my first opportunity. And then I parlayed that volunteerism into my first job in a social justice organization or a social organization doing advocacy, which was working for the Northwest AIDS Foundation in Seattle.
Wow. I mean, it's great to hear that continuity of dedication to what you truly believe in and your values and being able to advocate for yourself, which is a core part of what we're trying to encourage people to do. So are there preferred ways that you like to practice social advocacy?
Sure. Well, there are two things. I think you just said advocating for yourself, and that's a different story than I think being part of an organized group and advocating for a cause that you believe in. When you're talking about advocating for yourself, or if you're talking about advocating for a cause in which you believe, I think there's two main ways that I think about doing this. And it depends on what the power structure is that you're trying to address. Change comes from addressing power, right? Whoever's in power to change the policies or the laws. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a legislative body, sometimes it's the public, right? The general public. You have to know two things. You have to know your own personal narrative or a narrative that makes sense to people, telling a story that helps illustrate your cause. And you also have to know the data behind it because you never know what's going to move that power, what's going to move the person in power or the body in power, right? Is it going to be a personal story that they just can't forget or a story about somebody who the issue affects? Or is it going to be the numbers, right? Is it going to overwhelm someone to hear something extraordinary about how the numbers are affecting us, what's happening in the population, or something that they just can't forget that's a fact, right? And some people are moved by those facts, and some people are moved by those stories. So to have both of those in your arsenal is a very effective way to start advocating.
Right. It's the right and the left side of the brain. We need to make sure that we provide a holistic picture, which
Yes,
requires the narrative and the facts.
it's a great
Um,
way to think about it.
so, moving more towards your professional work, can you tell us a little bit about UW Impact?
Yes, UW Impact is a program of the UW Alumni Association, the University of Washington Alumni Association. We are the legislative advocacy program of the Alumni Association. So when people think about getting involved as an alum, they often think about being a donor, or maybe being a member, or maybe they're thinking about attending events or becoming a mentor. There are many ways traditionally that alumni become engaged or stay engaged with their university once they graduate. The Alumni Association having a legislative advocacy program is different for a lot of folks. They don't really think about that being a duty or a role of alums. But what we have done in creating this program is given folks an opportunity to advocate for our public university. So University of Washington is a public university. We are publicly funded, meaning we get our money from the state. We also get money from the federal government, and being able to articulate what that money goes to do, what it does, and how much it means to us is very, very important. So for instance, K through 12, of course, is a publicly funded system, public schools, and there are extremely active PTAs. There are extremely active teachers unions. The legislators can't forget that PTAs and teachers unions exist. They're a huge force. But when somebody cuts higher education, when a legislature cuts higher education, for the longest time they were hearing crickets. Nothing happened, right? People were saying, hey, wait a minute, don't cut higher ed. This is access to opportunity. This is an economic driver that's creating critical research. It's fulfilling critical jobs. Don't do it. They weren't hearing that. They were hearing it maybe from the university presidents, but they weren't hearing it from constituents. But we know that the grassroots have a lot of power. Constituents have a lot of power. And it's critical for us to speak up when these things happen, because you don't want the pipeline to stop at K through 12. You want to give people access to higher education and all of that, all the benefits that come with it, right? It's good for the individual, it's good for the society, it's good for research, and keeping it well funded is really an important part of what we do. So we started this organization. The Big Ten and the SEC are two conferences that had public universities with strong advocacy groups. And we started looking at that right around the Great Recession and said, I wonder if the University of Washington could do something similar. Our president at the time was excited about the idea of doing that, the university president at the time, and he connected with the Alumni Association's leadership and said, what do you think? Can we start this? And I was a recent graduate of the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, which I know you're a recent grad yourself. And we started thinking about how we could make that happen, and I felt equipped to do that. So I was working at the Alumni Association at the time as the the associate director of alumni relations. And then when we started this new program, I became the director, and have just loved every minute of it. It's really a neat opportunity for us. So alums can get involved, they can stay connected that way, and you get to work with a group of people who care deeply about higher education, see the value in the opportunities, want to keep it accessible and affordable, which is something we know our alums care about when we poll them. So it's my honor to be at the helm of that.
I appreciate so much of what you just shared and the work that you do. Also, the Evans shout out, uh, and especially since you're right, higher education. There's so much that we don't necessarily associate, even though we know it's public, with what the ripple effects of what happens when there are cuts. As a recent tuition payer, it does have tremendous effects into the decision making of whether or not to pursue higher education. So I'm so excited to have you and to be able to shine a little bit more of a spotlight on what UW Impact does. So, what are maybe if you could name a few kind of key ways that the work intersects with social advocacy? In what ways do these alumni participate in social advocacy?
Sure. When we talk about the specific, when we drill down into what alums care about, because we've polled them, so we know that they care about three things. They care about access and affordability. They care about quality and excellence. They want to make sure that when people are going to the University of Washington, that they're getting a quality education, that our rankings stay, admirable, and that we're and that the value of their degrees is staying, in high, right? And then the third thing is high demand degrees. They want to know that people can get into high demand degree programs that our region demands, right? The Puget Sound region and the Pacific Northwest in general, huge high tech all up and down the West Coast. We want to know, our alums want to know that when we accept students into the University of Washington, that they can get into these programs, that they can graduate, and that they can receive jobs, right? So when we're talking about the social advocacy portion of that, that can hit people in different ways. So I work with a lot of alums who are on advisory councils of the various colleges and departments, and they think to themselves, gosh, if I didn't have this opportunity, I wouldn't have the life I have today, right? And sometimes that opportunity can be the opportunity to get into one of those high demand degree programs, right? It can be the opportunity to go to college in general, that access and affordability piece. Because we were well funded, I received the state need grant, and something like that. So depending on what your personal anecdote is, you may be, so well connected in this space that you can create your story and really sell it to folks. So that's really where the social advocacy part comes in, is people reflecting on what part of higher ed made a difference for me, and how can I make sure that that difference and that opportunity remains for future generations.
Great. So,
That answer the question? I hope so.
yeah, it definitely does. And everyone has a reason that they are passionate. Um, Obviously, if you're a University of Washington alum, you have some sort of value in higher education. So, how would those individuals, how can they get involved with UW Impact? And then is it only for alumni?
That's a great question. It is not only for alumni. It really is for anyone who feels strongly about the opportunity of higher education. Right now, we're talking a lot about racial equity, right? And we know that higher education can help advance racial equity, not only in giving folks the opportunity to participate in the economy, which is something that I think a lot of folks like to lean on. Well, it gets everybody jobs. That is true. But there are also leadership opportunities that are just critical for people when they're in college. And we have an extraordinary Office of Minority Affairs and Diversity. We have a great ethnic cultural center. These opportunities are so valuable when we're talking about advancing racial equity, right? So some of our alums come to it from there, right? Where they say, I care so deeply about the racial equity piece that I want to, or not even alums, excuse me, members of the community. They care so much about the racial equity piece that they see the value in higher education, and they might want to connect that way. So it really is for everybody. Of course, our alums can make the strongest case and feel the most connected to it. So we mostly engage with alumni. They connect through various ways. So we have people can join by simply going to uwimpact.org and clicking the join button and signing up to receive our action alerts. People follow us on Twitter and on Facebook, so they understand when we have a critical need for something that's happening then. There are, many opportunities for people to get involved through their university departments and their units, their colleges. If they're still volunteers there, they might sit on an advisory committee. They may sit on a visiting committee, depending on what they call it there, and they can connect that way. So we are always out in the field too with parents. So there's a parent opportunity. If you have a student in school right now who's receiving aid from the state, you care very much about whether or not that aid from the state stays well funded. So we connect with parents too and ask them to become part of the effort. So those are myriad ways that people can get involved in UW Impact and start advocating for what they care about there.
Amazing. It's so glad to I'm so glad to hear that it's not um, that it's open to everyone, that it's all welcoming because uh, this is an incredible institution that offers so much to so many. It's important to make sure that we advocate for that. My last question for you is, what advice would you give to someone who is new to social advocacy?
The advice I would give is do not be intimidated. I think so many people think about advocacy and social advocacy and they think, well, I'm not really equipped to talk about this. I don't really understand how to get in touch with my lawmakers. I don't know who they are. I'm not sure where to start. And my advice is they're all just people. This is just a conversation. Your voice does matter because a lot of people think that they have to have a lot of money or influence or power in order to engage in these conversations. But I will tell you that the grassroots and the people who are the everyday folks really have a unique voice in this, and absolutely their voices need to be heard. So my biggest piece of advice is don't be intimidated. Link up with an organization that can help you receive the training and the speaking points and any other resources that you might need, and go for it. Right. This is something that, we don't want people to be resting on their laurels because of fear. We want people to get over the intimidation factor, realize it's just a great way to be heard, and that it actually does make a difference. And when you start seeing those differences being made, when you start having a few wins, then you start to understand that it really is us that's powering this thing, and maybe not the people that you might typically think.
I love that. It's um, almost similar to like the small actions lead to major changes, where it you may be one individual but so are they, the people in
Yep.
power, also a single individual, and it's finding that way to get through to them, with what's important, going back to what you said earlier, that your narrative and the facts, that it's one person to another. Thank you so much for a really phenomenal conversation, from one MPA to another. It's been fantastic to speak with you, to learn about the various ways that we as folks in the UW universe can get involved, advocate for this university, and see changes be made. So thank you so very much.
Happy to be a resource. If anybody wants to find me, I'm not in the university directory, but go to uwimpact.org and you can find my contact information there.
Great. Thank you so much.